really happen? All of that and more is coming up.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to this week's episode of Faith versus Culture. I'm Goins-Phillips here today with Billy Hallowell and Jarrod Anderson. But Billy, I'll go to you first. You have a brand new documentary talking about miracles and really documenting some pretty incredible stories. But before we dive into some of the specifics of those stories, talk about why Investigating the Supernatural was a documentary that you really wanted to dive into.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, this is a topic that people love. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're in the church, outside of the church, this idea that people are miraculously healed, that they had a disease that is no longer there, they had a struggle that is gone. That's something that deeply resonates with people because it's part of the human condition. So I think that is one area that I've always loved looking at. And so for, I think, our team being able to dive into this from an investigative perspective, right, really going into it and exploring those cases and not just taking them on face value when somebody says they've had this miraculous thing happen, going into the evidence, right, and unpacking that. And so Jarrod had an incredible vision for that, as he will talk about after, and we were able to dig in. And I'll tell you, as you get into it and you start seeing those stories unfold, it's a pretty transformational process.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Jarrod, as kind of the brains behind the operation that really made all of this happen, talk about the process of working on a documentary like this. Bring us into some of the behind the scenes of what made this happen and how you prepare for a documentary like this, because there are going to be a lot of people who watch it who may be skeptical, but there was a ton of research on the back end that went into actually, bringing these miracles to the screen.
Sure. Yeah, I think it actually ties into a bit to my own story. I mean, I was a skeptic, a former skeptic. I didn't become a Christian until I was 18, and it was when I witnessed a miracle happen before my eyes that I was actually like, okay, maybe there's more to Christianity, maybe there's more to this, than what I thought originally. And so I think, now I'm a Christian, that was about, 10, 15 years ago. So now I think looking back on that, I'm like, I want to tell a story that's going to help other people who are skeptical just like me. So I think getting into this story, Billy and I were kind of like, okay, what are we going to do? We talked about doing a 3-part mini series. And the more we did interviews, we just were like, we've got so much material here. We just need to do one on miracles and just start there. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. We've got other ones in the series that, we're interested in doing, but it's a lot of digging into a lot of research. I've read a lot of books, let's put it that way, and interviewed a lot of people. But it's been a really fun journey too. I've learned a lot of things that, I didn't know before.
Jarrod, have you thought, like you mentioned, you're in a different place now than you were 10 or 15 years ago, but have you thought about maybe the you from 15 years ago, how you would have been interpreting the research that you went into and diving into some of these miraculous stories and saying like, wow, medically on paper, this doesn't make any sense. How would you 15 years ago take in that information versus how you now as a believer are taking that information in?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think I still have that skeptical mindset. And so whenever I'm approaching these things constantly, I'm going to Billy, it could have been this, though. It could have been this. And we examine these cases. A lot of the cases in this documentary, I mean, we are heavily vetted. I mean, we analyze them and really go, what are the other, what else could it have been? And we'll look at these things. We have the medical documentation. We're talking with other experts in the field. And, so I think that skeptical mindset is still there, even though I do believe in these things. I still am constantly thinking, well, there are people out there who do fake these things, and there are, cases where there are misdiagnoses, and, but, when you really dig into this, there are definitely cases, and we found them, that there are no other naturalistic explanations for.
Hmm. Billy, I think that raises an interesting question, right? We should be skeptical, especially as journalists. You want to investigate these things and make sure that we've buttoned up all the details. You've been at this in media now for a long time, so you're used to this kind of investigative work. But as Christians, we also don't want to be cynical, right? I want to be skeptical and get all the facts, but I don't want to be cynical. And I want my mind and my heart to be open to the possibility of something pretty incredible, pretty miraculous unfolding. So talk some about that as carrying those two perspectives, I guess, of being a journalist who wants to get all the facts right, but also being a Christian whose mind and heart is open to the supernatural.
Yeah, I love this question because it's the thing I've thought about the most as we've been working on this. I mean, we started this in 2023, and so here we are now releasing this in 2025. It's been a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of, the other day Jarrod said we really have traveled across the country on this, and we have telling these stories. And so, the one thing I've loved about working with Jarrod is everything he just said, making sure that we are crossing our T's, dotting our I's, that the research is clear. There are lots of stories we looked at that have not been included. And they didn't maybe pass muster. It doesn't mean they weren't miracles, but we wanted to be very careful with that because the other element of this as Christians, right, we need to care about the truth. So we want to make sure we don't want to be cynical and we don't want to dismiss all these things. But at the same time, we don't want to be saying something is 100% a miracle or true when we don't have evidence to bring us to a place where we could comfortably say that. And I think that for me, though, taking all of that into account, the other side of this, when people dismiss every miracle, when they say, and there are a lot of scientists, a lot of doctors who do this, right? They have no room for miracles because they don't see things through any sort of lens outside of the material. The danger of that is there are people potentially, and this came through, and you'll see this in the documentary, who are not getting the help that they might need, the spiritual help they might need. They're maybe not even doing the sort of praying they need to do, the trusting they need to do to get to healing. And so there's actually a danger in overemphasizing stories without evidence, but I think there's even a bigger danger in underemphasizing and trying to dismiss everything and say, oh no, there has to be a natural explanation, when really there could be a great prescription there for healing that people might not be seeing. And I feel like the journey sort of led us to a place where we were able to very clearly see the balance that is needed in how you address these things.
Yeah, for sure. And Jarrod, I think you come at it obviously from an interesting perspective, trying to walk out that balance and walk that tightrope as somebody who came from the background you came from, but also somebody who's experienced miraculous things in your own life. So talk a little bit about some of that and what it was that happened in your life that inspired you to be so fascinated by the potential for the miraculous now more largely.
For sure, yeah. Well, I think one of the main things was I witnessed a healing. There was a young girl at a conference who could not run. Her knees were bent inwards, and after prayer, she began running around the conference room. And here's a 6, 7, 8-year-old little girl running around and claiming these things. It was amazing, and her reaction, and it really jarred me. It made me think, well, like maybe miracles do happen. But then I kept going, but well, we would definitely hear about it in the news. We would definitely, if this was true, we would, this would be all over the place. And the more I began to dig in and talk with people, the more I began to find out that there are definitely a lot more of these happening, but they're not always taken at face value. They're often cast aside. And, as we started making this documentary, we learned a lot about why that's the case, and it's one of the main reasons is just because most Americans and most people who live in the West have a naturalistic view of the world. They don't even have a grid or a framework for supernatural phenomena. And that's something that I really try to get after in this documentary is really trying to open people's minds, because my mind was kind of opened in that moment. And I want to help other people open their minds to, not everything that happens in this world can be explained by natural phenomena.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Billy, the documentary is investigating the supernatural miracles. We're going to fit in a quick break here, but for people who want more information about where they can go when it comes out and what day it comes out, let us know real quick.
Yep, it's March 11th. It drops, and you can go over to cbn.com/supernatural.
Awesome. All right, everybody, stick with us. We'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture.
And I slipped. I couldn't use the whole right side of my body.
I went from having a promising career as a neuroscientist to having a medical death sentence. People would pray for me, and sometimes it felt like this power that just zapped me.
So how do you know this wasn't psychosomatic, a misdiagnosis, something that was being missed in that process? Are miracles real? Do they happen today? Let's investigate.
Welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. I'm joined by Billy Hallowell and Jarrod Anderson behind the new CBN documentary investigating the supernatural miracles. Billy, for people who are familiar with your work, you've done a lot of work and research and writing on the supernatural, but a lot of your work has been more geared toward the dark side, the negative side of that, dealing with the demonic and spiritual warfare. And this is kind of the flip side of that coin, right? You're investigating the supernatural and the positive ways that the Lord can intervene in the here and now in really miraculous ways. So talk some about that as your perspective, coming from where you have come from and the work that you've done, and now, investigating, like I said, the more positive and uplifting and encouraging side of the supernatural realm.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when we talk about the darker side, we often will talk about Ephesians 6, right? This spiritual battle that we're in. And this is a reality that I think all of us, and we've talked a lot about this on the show, we're all in, whether we want to admit it or not, whether we realize it or not. There is a spiritual battle we do not see, and it pours over into the world in which we live. And it affects everything that is going on, from our individual lives to our corporate lives to our political, social structures. I mean, all of it is impacted. It's all one package. And so up until this project, I had only really thought about that in terms of dealing with evil and how you confront that. And that's what Ephesians 6 is about. But it's also about the other side of this, which is, spiritual goodness and fighting for healing and appealing to God for those things. And that's part of the battle, fighting the battle, being a Christian, living that life out. And so we were able to look at it in a totally different way. And it really, for me, this project, more than anything, has transformed the way in which I look at the Lord and what is possible, right? When I look at God, was I limiting God before? And I think that's a big question for all of us, whether you're a Christian, an agnostic, wherever you are, but particularly for Christians, are we limiting what God can do in our belief system? And if we are, does that limit our ability to get something like healing? And I want to be very careful because there are people who are faithful and they pray, and I'm sure we'll talk about this today, and they do everything and they're pursuing God and they don't get healing on this side of eternity. But the point is the quest to trust God in that and seek him, being able to look at this particular issue has really helped me personally navigate that.
Yeah, Jarrod, along that same vein, how's the process of making this documentary maybe challenged some of your assumptions or deepened your faith in God, or maybe it's done both?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's definitely done a bit of both. I think I think I used to think, if you start to look into these things, your faith might get a little rocky, or you might just find, explanations that kind of explain it. Not necessarily that I didn't think that it was a miracle, but that maybe God wouldn't allow you to find evidence. And the more that we've kind of dug into this, I feel like that's kind of challenged that assumption. I do feel like God allows a certain amount of evidence. Do I feel like there's going to be a foolproof 100%, evidence that, God exists and miracles exist? Maybe not necessarily, but I do think that he does allow maybe for 90%, maybe for 80%. And there is always going to be an element of, your faith that has to come into play here. But the more I've actually been surprised by the amount of evidence that we have come up with that really points to these miracles, being straight from God. And I think that that's really challenged and deepened my faith in a lot of ways.
Yeah, for sure. Billy, what would you tell people who are listening to this or watching our conversation and they haven't received the miracle? What do both people, the people who are getting the miracle and the people who maybe are still waiting on a miracle, hoping that it happens on this side of eternity, what does that reveal in both scenarios about the goodness and the sovereignty of God? Because I think it's easy to look at the goodness of God and acknowledge it when the miracle does happen, right? But when the miracle doesn't happen, that doesn't actually call into question whether God is good or not. But I think that's hard for us sometimes to reconcile.
Yeah, and I'd love for Jarrod to jump in on this after too, because it's incredibly important, and we deal with this in the film because this is not a film where we're sort of whitewashing that and ignoring it. It has to be dealt with because it's part of the process. But when you look at Scripture, you see Paul was dealing with a thorn. We don't know what it was. There's lots of ideas about what that was that he didn't seem to get any relief from, right? We see a woman who's suffering for 12 years and, with a problem with bleeding, and she's so desperate, going back to that desperation, that all she wants to do is reach out and touch Jesus's cloak, and knowing that if she does, she can get healing. And she does end up getting healing, right? But she waited 12 years and suffered and gave up all of her money and everything in the process. And so we have to understand this all comes back to trust. And I think that is the toughest part, right? Not knowing, am I going to get the healing on this side of eternity? Am I going to get it on the other side of eternity? And when we fully trust in God, I think it transforms how we look at all of this. We fully believe that a healing is possible. We trust him for it, but we're comfortable. And this is a very hard place, I think, for people to get. We all struggle with this, I think, but we're comfortable with whatever is decided in God's plan. And that's a really tough tension point. But I would encourage people to trust. I always say, if you don't have peace, pray for it. If you don't have hope, pray for it. If you are struggling, pray for relief, and really trust that no matter what happens, I don't want to just candy coat this answer, but I think this is important, that we trust that God will do what is in his will.
Yeah, for sure. I think, God says that he will give us peace when we ask for it, right? He'll give it to us in abundance. And he says he'll give us wisdom when we ask for it. But sometimes we have to be okay with realizing that peace and that wisdom is not going to look maybe the way that we thought it was going to look, and we have to be okay with that as believers. Jarrod, I wanted to get your thoughts if you wanted to chime in on anything Billy just said when it comes to wrestling with that issue of doubt.
Yeah. One of the things that one of our theologians in the documentary said that really stands out to me right now is that, it ties in with what Billy said, faith is trust. But another one of them said to me that we got to be careful that we don't have faith in our own faith. And that really has stuck out to me, that sometimes we feel like we can just will it. We can just, that we can, in some kind of our own power, make something happen. And and he really kind of came against that. And it made me really think about, this life of faith, and especially when it pertains to miracles, that, we can have our faith, but we can't make these things happen. We can't, but there is, at the same time, there's this dynamic of desperation that plays into that. And every one of the stories in this documentary, there's an aspect of people being desperate and doing whatever they think they can do. God, would you heal me? They would go to all these healing, every one of these stories, they're going to all these healing meetings, constantly seeking, God, that he would heal them. And so there's this interesting, balance of, of faith and desperation. And sometimes it's not always clear. And sometimes, it's a challenging journey. I think each of us on this call, we probably each have our own story of things that we're navigating in our own personal lives. So, I'd like to say it's black and white, but it can be challenging navigating that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, everybody stick with us. We'll be right back with more Faith versus Culture.
And I slipped. I couldn't use the whole right side of my body.
I went from having a promising career as a neuroscientist to having a medical death sentence. People would pray for me, and sometimes it felt like this power that just zapped me.
So how do you know this wasn't psychosomatic, a misdiagnosis, something that was being missed in that process? Are miracles real? Do they happen today? Let's investigate.
Welcome back to Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. You know, Billy, we've talked so much about this documentary and just the different assets or aspects of what it is to investigate miracles, right? Especially as believers. And for people who are going to go in and they're going to watch this documentary, they're going to stream it by the DVD, whatever. What are you hoping that they take away from watching this?
You know, I'm hoping that ultimately they're open to what God is doing, no matter where they are in their spiritual journey, whether they're in the church, outside of the church, that they have an open heart and open eyes, and that they're willing to look at the evidence and see where it brings them, and not allow their presuppositions to make that an impossibility for them. I've heard from people already who have seen screeners and watched it, how they have been challenged by it. They have been very emotional. The stories are very emotional. So I'm hoping there's a deep spiritual impact on those who do watch this film.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump in too and just say that, you know, I feel like people are looking for hope. And I feel like this documentary really shows that, you know, that we can hope, that we can have hope in dire situations where, you know, loved ones, you know, are facing medical crisis. You know, life can be so challenging. And so I really feel like I want people to walk away from this documentary having a deeper sense of hope and trust in God, and that, you know, that there is solid evidence that does point toward the miraculous. And, you know, the other aspect of it for people who are really skeptical, I want them to walk away and go, well, if miracles are real, then God must be real, because that's the only other conclusion you can really draw.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a fantastic place to leave it. Again, for anybody who wants to check out the documentary, it is Investigating the Supernatural Miracles, available on March 11th. You can go to cbn.com and get all the information for that there. Jarrod and Billy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I slipped. I couldn't use the whole right side of my body.
I went from having a promising career as a neuroscientist to having a medical death sentence. People would pray for me, and sometimes it felt like this power that just zapped me.
So how do you know this wasn't psychosomatic, a misdiagnosis, something that was being missed in that process? Are miracles real? Do they happen today? Let's investigate.
That is all the time we have for this week's episode of Faith versus Culture here on the CBN News Channel. Again, if you want to check out the documentary Investigating the Supernatural Miracles, it comes out March 11th. You can go to cbn.com for all of that information. And for more news, go to cbnnews.com and never miss any news of the day. Thank you so much for being here, and God bless you.